Hi there, everybody. Thank you for joining me today in my webinar. I'm talking today about the stress response, and I'm really wanting to give you tools and help you understand the brain chemistry that's behind our stress response. So whether we're talking about adults and just everyday emotional regulation, or whether we're talking about spectrum children or teenagers, children in general, who really struggle with their stress response, I want to give you an insight and a path forward more than anything about the importance of brain health and how if we don't have the necessary building blocks, we will have a recurrency in symptoms. So let's talk about the symptoms first. You know that you have an exaggerated or a disproportionate stress response if you have issues with emotional regulation, if you have issues with working memory, if you have issues with spatial awareness, if you have issues with spatial memory. So that is being given, like I do my eldest daughter, giving her 3 or 4 instructions, and she struggles with the regulation and processing of different pieces of information. Most of the time, this is actually a cortisol issue. And the cortisol is a result of an electrical misfire in the brain synapses, and that is linked to the amygdala and the hippocampus. Now, why is this relevant? Because those of us who are very empowered in our parenting, empowered in the nutrition, the organic foods, the very conscious living that we bring into our homes and our families, we know the environments in which us and our children thrive in, but unfortunately we don't have the ability oftentimes to control those things. So a lot of the time our children and ourselves have circumstances in our lives that are out of our control, that are out of what perhaps we would choose for ourselves, that we know are optimum. And in those moments, it's very essential that we have the building blocks to actually have adaptive functions. So this is not just adaptive problem-solving thinking, the ability to resolve something, the ability to process something in a healthy way, but it's also the ability for it to not become a somatic response. So I work with a lot of people in my practice who have somatic memory and somatic responses. And oftentimes we only connect this to people who have experienced trauma, who have experienced PTSD or are experiencing PTSD, people who have been a result of physical, emotional, spiritual, psychological abuse, people who have experienced narcissistic abuse, who have been raised by parents of alcoholics and addiction. All of these things lead to a reduction in the ability to process and adapt on a stress level. And so our stress response becomes very compromised. So for these people, we don't have the adaptogenics, we don't have it biochemically, and also we become somatically impacted. So that means the body has a stress response. So I want you to think for a moment about a stressful experience that you've experienced, and that perhaps it didn't even seem as stressful as what was warranted that you felt in your body. So I see this often with children who get themselves worked up to the point of nausea, vomiting, sitting on the toilet for, half an hour to an hour and a half before they actually go to school because they have a play or they have to stand up in front of the class and do a presentation. This is an unadaptive stress response, and it's a result of biochemistry issues. It's not normal for a child to be that worked up and have a physiological response to that. Similarly, those of us as adults who've experienced trauma or have experienced a lot of long-term stress, the brain chemistry does change and it is impacted in the long term. And so understanding that really gives us a lot of grace, and it gives us a lot of time and space for us to heal. And it's important that we are healing those things. It's important that we are working towards better emotional regulation, better synaptic function in the brain, that the neurotransmitters are not going to misfire and have a somatic response. So for me, what this looked like is when I was mugged in San Francisco in January 2019, my body had a somatic response to the trauma. And if I do not continually work on my stress response and work on my adaptogenic behavior, work on my conscious behavior, my conscious thinking, and this is where therapy, meditation, mindfulness comes into it, my body can very quickly go into a somatic response in which it shuts down. And what that is, it's the body's protective mechanism. And we see this to different varying degrees with people who have experienced trauma, long-term stress, or very high, intermittent and acute stress. And that is that the body will begin to shut down, and it shuts down by shutting the gut down. It shuts down emotionally. It shuts down with emotional regulation. And so really we need to think of our bodies as a bit of a car. So when you think about, you go in to buy a new car, you expect that everything in that car is going to work. But what would have happened if, as part of that car getting manufactured in the plant in which the car came from, what if there were faulty bolts, or there was a faulty piece that was put into that car? You still have the expectation that you bought a car and it's completely efficient and it's functioning, but it has a faulty part. And so therefore, you, as a result of that faulty part, there are consequences. Now, you as the adult driving the car, you can feel it. The car doesn't run as smoothly. The car doesn't work the way that you expected it to. And it has a bit of a clunk, okay? And maybe this clunk becomes more of a clunk, and then it starts to blow a gasket. Now, this is what I see in a lot of adult symptom pictures in my practice. They say, it used to be a clunk. It used to be that there was a faulty part. There was a part of my brain that didn't work. There was a part of my emotional regulation, or my somatic response was not as big. And then over time, because I haven't looked at it, I haven't known what to do, then this becomes more of a somatic response where I blow a gasket. And I'm now yelling at my children, and I'm going from 0 to 100 in a very small amount of time, and I don't want to live like that. Well, the good news is that you don't need to live like that, okay? And it is a result of biochemistry and synaptic misfire. And this is because the hippocampus reduces volume and it reduces in size when we experience long-term stress. So it is true from what you hear and what you read and what other doctors have told you, which is long-term stress greatly deteriorates your health, because it actually reduces the surface area of the hippocampus in the brain. Now, the hippocampus and the amygdala, I won't get too scientific, but these two work together in terms of emotional regulation. And if the synaptic function cannot be adaptive and it can't be accurate because of the electrical impulses on the hippocampus, because there's less volume, because that organ begins to shrink, then we will have these synaptic misfires. And this is a lot of the time what we see in special needs children. We see it in a lot of our spectrum kids, is that when they're born with an underdeveloped amygdala, and they also have a reduction in size in the surface volume, the surface area for these electrical impulses in the brain on the hippocampus. So when we do that, understand this. It's very empowering to both as an adult who's working through having more of an adaptive stress response, but it's very empowering as a parent of children who struggle in this way, children who are hyperactive, they have low concentration and focus, they struggle to learn concepts and new things without getting frustrated and without imploding or exploding. This has got to do with real brain chemistry stuff. So this lack of surface volume, and when I think about the hippocampus and I think about it shrinking into itself, that's what happens after a traumatic experience. After being mugged in San Francisco, I shrunk. I shrunk into myself. I shrunk into my belief in myself, my trust in the world. My ability to process information was reduced because my somatic response kicked in. So what happens is, if we don't have these adaptive behavioral responses and we don't have the chemistry to support that in the body biochemically, we will continue to have this shrinking in adaptive response. And this is where we see men and women who are paralyzed in their ability to make decisions. They are very sensitive to judgment and criticism. They do not trust their ability to perceive things accurately and to synthesize information. Now, I talk about all of these things, and I'm talking about the clinical picture that I work with in my practice. But I don't want you to think that it doesn't come with hope and with light at the end of the tunnel, because it does. The great thing is that the brain can and does have the impact to be rewired. And plant-based nutrition is a really big part of this. It is not all of my cases, but definitely most of my clinical cases of PTSD, history of trauma, any kind of narcissistic, physical, emotional, psychological, sexual abuse, that I ask them to adopt a clean, high plant-based organic diet. The reason for this is because it's very easy for the body to receive the information from these foods, from these whole grains. Also, if I recommend whole grains, they're always organic. Quinoa and brown rice, please make sure you soak them first. These are the things that the body can very easily synthesize into the biochemical pieces that are needed for an adaptive stress response. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about magnesium. I'm talking about potassium. I'm talking about all of the low trace elements. I'm talking about iodine. I'm talking about all of these nutrients and micronutrients that are required, antioxidants, high levels, to be able to clean up the brain tissue and have the building blocks for new synaptic pathways to actually be carved out in the brain. Now, this doesn't happen quickly. And this is why a lot of people come into my care for 3 to 4 months at a time. We do the work, nutritionally, we do the work with remedies to reduce the inflammation in the brain, because the brain becomes inflamed with long-term stress. And so when you think about it, if a joint in the brain a joint in the body is inflamed, we'll see redness, we'll see pain, we'll see swelling, we'll see heat. The same thing happens in the brain. Neurologically, we blow a gasket, we become hot-headed because there is an inflammatory response in the brain, and this is because there are not the nutrients that are needed biochemically to regulate. So think about the stress response somatically in the body, the central nervous system, the adrenals, all of these things work together to keep the body cool, just like a cooling system does in the car. Now, what happens if the cooling system doesn't work in a car? We blow a gasket. And so what happens is the emotional regulation misfires. We start yelling at the people who are around us who are trying to help. We interpret information incorrectly. I had a situation recently where my daughter, I was just asking, are they the shoes that you're wearing? And she had an unadaptive response where she became very offended to my comments. Of course, this is the shoes that I'm wearing. How dare you? What's wrong with these shoes? And she had a exaggerated, disproportionate response to the information because she was in a stress response that was not adaptive. She was not able to integrate those things. And she's been having a lot more inflammatory foods in her diet. She's been having a lot of extra cortical stimulation through screen times, loud music, not as much restorative REM sleep and the parasympathetic nervous system through meditation, mindfulness, yoga. So we've got to look at these things and we've got to start piecing together in an environment in which we can heal. Now, I work with men and women who come to me and they say, I don't know how, but I know I need to. I know I need to work on this. I'm seeing all the symptoms in my life. And unfortunately, they're not just symptoms of me feeling like I'm blowing a gasket and not being the person that I want to be, but I'm starting to see these symptoms show up in my relationships, in my workplace. Perhaps they're not able to manage their relationships and have that emotional regulation. And one of my patients has a very narcissistic boss. And that is the person in his life that's gone, right, this is enough of a trigger. I need to actually take responsibility for this. Now, whether or not we're aware of what is triggering it at this time, and it's definitely not our fault if we've experienced trauma or abuse, it is our responsibility to heal it. And if we don't heal it emotionally and physically with a real lot of conscious effort, a lot of the time what I see clinically is it shows up in pathology and we have to look at it at some point. So let's talk about what you can do. So the plant-based diet is really essential, and then learning to take care of yourself. Self-regulation, saying no, saying yes to things without saying yes because of duty and obligation, making sure that your heart is really into something that you're going to pursue, that you are going to find the energy. It's not just going to be adrenal burnout, following through on what you said that you would do. So regulating your environment, regulating yourself within your life. And I encourage a lot of my patients who come in for this treatment, when you are coming in and you're investing that much energy and time in consulting with me and working through your stuff, we have to have the time and space to heal. And a lot of the time, that's about creating a new space for yourself to heal. A lot of people find that journaling works really well. Mindfulness, more of an exercise practice, okay? Making and carving out time in your day to do gratitude journals, manifestation journals, looking at regulating your environment, hydration and exercise, putting all of these building blocks in that are really the beginning of self-care. Because when we have a somatic or even just a biochemical and emotional response to stress, the first thing that will go out of the window is self-care, because we are constantly in a state of stress adaptation. We're putting out one fire to the next. And people ask me all the time, why is it that you treat the family at the same time as an individual? And this has really been driven by the idea that women, particularly mothers who live in this state of adapting or trying to adapt to stress, they actually, 20, 30 years on of just kind of placating, and I don't have time, or I don't have the resources, they then get hit with pathology, and that pathology often has a running clock, whether it be an autoimmune disease, whether it be a terminal diagnosis. And at that point, the body has withheld and done as much as it possibly can to hold on, but it can't do it anymore. And so it becomes super important that women start putting themselves as the center, that their well-being, their self-care is just as valid and just as important as the squeaky wheel gets the oil parenting that a lot of us do. Those of us who have special needs, spectrum children with allergies, sensitivity, asthma, eczema, there is so much extra strength and lack of sleep and adrenal load to care for, heal, and get these sick kids well, that we put ourselves to the last in the pile. And this is why I treat the family as a whole, so that we're treating every family member and we're actually all achieving health and wellness and well-being all at the same time. Because if we don't do this, the squeaky wheel will always get the oil, and unfortunately then the pathology will hit, and it does hit, and then there's some real cleanup and fast cleanup that has to be done. So carving out that time, making yourself a priority, making yourself as important as your children. Put yourself to bed earlier. Okay, eat good, nourishing foods. Don't just live from one stimulant to the other, whether it be alcohol or caffeine or sugar. These are crutches that are there that keep us upright and functioning. They keep us putting the fires out, but really it deteriorates the biochemistry. And I want to talk about homeopathic miasms for a moment. If you haven't been introduced to this concept before, it's the idea, it's a homeopathic terminology, but the idea that we all have a predisposition to certain levels and sphere of action of diseases. So in my family, there's a lot of overgrowth of tissue, there's a lot of breast cancer, there's a lot of autoimmune disease. So I know that if I'm not consciously working on these things, then I'm more likely to experience them in the future. Similarly, people come to me and they say bowel cancer is a really big thing, or alcoholism or depression is a big thing, or osteoporosis is a big thing in my family. What can I do to be proactively preventing that from happening to me and to my kids? Now, homeopathic medicine offers miasmatic treatment when it comes to this. And so what you do see is that the psychotic miasm, which is not crazy psychotic, it's psychotic, S-Y-C-O-T-I-C. The psychotic miasm is the second miasm that we find a lot of my patients are coming. They feel bogged, they feel sluggish, they feel tired. And in this miasm, specifically when we're talking about the adaptive stress response and cortisol levels, we have the beginning of very high rising cortisol levels. And so what we see there is very hyper responses to everything, easily offended, easy reactions, very quick to anger, finding it hard to forgive. These are the emotional things, but biochemically we see that there's weight gain, there's skin tags starting to form, overgrowth of tissue, so that can be cancerous and precancerous tissue. So people who come to me who submit their new patient form through the website, and then I do the pre-case analysis, if I find that the psychotic miasm is active, that's when we're really starting to talk about detox. We're talking about sweating, we're talking about a plant-based diet, if not paleo, maybe even stronger if there's pathology beginning to show up. If we're having any kind of animal proteins, they must be organic. And why? Because in the psychotic miasm, we don't have the ability to synthesize nutrients and then detoxify what we don't need. And so a lot of children and adults who have the active MTHFR are bogged in this second psychotic miasm. Just as equally important and destructive biochemically, we see the active tubercular miasm. Now, a lot of patients who have active tubercular miasms are more likely to experience memory issues or somatic memory. So even if they haven't had a traumatic experience or something that they can identify as this is what the cause was, they will have a lower adaptogenic stress response. And sometimes they can have low cortisol, in that if they are in a flight or fight response, they don't have the ability to respond and react. And so we see them having underdeveloped emotional responses. So this is a really interesting piece when we talk about autism and children who don't understand that if I go and hit Jake on the head with the hammer from the building set at playgroup, that's going to hurt him. This is an active tubercular miasm. Children who can't see the difference between their little square on the mat that they're meant to sit on and the others. And what's wrong with me sitting on Sally? There's an underadaptive stress response that we see in this tubercular miasm. And so anti-tubercular medicines here are very, very important, as are the nutrients of magnesium and potassium. So having a very high nutrient diet and a very diverse nutrient diet. And it's often if we're in the active tubercular miasm that I will actually say we need more poultry, we need more red meat, we need bone broth, we need these things in the diet to get these levels of these base nutrients up, because without this we don't have the biochemistry to create that adaptation. Just as equally in the second, the third, and the fourth miasm, we have deterioration in gut function. So taking a probiotic every day through the form of a nutritional supplement sometimes, but more likely a nutrient from food. So sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha, fermented foods, having more bone broth becomes really essential, as does low chemical and low toxin food, because already the gut is compromised. So it's going to slow down when it has less to break it down with. And just as equally, it's going to have more hypersensitivity and more reactivity. So we see a lot of food allergies. And this is where we see asthma, and we see eczema, and we see hay fever, and all of these allergenic symptoms that tie in with poor behavior with children. And so my job is to see the individual as a complete organism, because there are several systems in the body that actually go down. And when we medicate our children with behavioral medications so that they can concentrate better at school, or they have better emotional responses, ADHD, it really is a band-aid of what is going on biochemically. And if we don't support them now, then as they grow into their teenagers and into their adulthood, we just see that these behaviors become very exaggerated. And this is where the data is coming in, that children who are struggling with stress response adaptation in their early childhood years are more likely to depression, suicidal tendencies, high highs and low lows, diagnoses such as bipolar, schizophrenia. And it's not that they necessarily even had a biochemical medical history of parents, but they're more likely to reach for substance for mitigation of those symptoms because they felt so out of control for so long. And this is where children reach for recreational drugs and alcohol to mitigate these symptoms. So stress and the stress response, we really need to start looking at as a biochemical issue. And this hippocampus can be rejuvenated. And you see that with constant challenging of the vital force through homeopathic medicine, we see these pathways open up. But nutritional elements are a really big thing. So I just want to take you through a few notes that I put down today about the things that you can do. And obviously, to speed up the process, homeopathic medicines are really amazing. They're really fast acting. And the beauty in homeopathic treatment is it's so fast. You can manage a panic attack. You can manage emotional regulation in a matter of minutes, which means that you're not deteriorating the adrenals and putting the load on the nervous system constantly and actually forcing that pathology deeper in. And so not only can we get off pharmaceutical medicines such as antidepressants, but we can have these things in our purse and in our homes to reach for, so that then if the wheels are falling off, that it very quickly gets regrouped, and then we can focus on the nutritional medicine underneath to create the biochemical change. But if you are somebody who you know has history of poor emotional regulation, or you do have trauma, working on amygdala health and working on hippocampus health is really paramount. And it's something that you'll always need to work on. But controlling what you can, and food is one of them. Okay, so start switching over your diet, start moving into organic food, start moving into whole grains and nourishing forms of protein that are not hormone laden. They're not full of hormones and antibiotics. They're actually the real thing, what they were intended to when they were created. Okay, learning to say no, learning to control what we can and reduce back. Okay, if your amygdala, your hippocampus is doing this, you will feel that in your life. You will feel like you want to withdraw. So intuitively step into that. Start regulating your time. Put yourself to sleep earlier. Introduce mindfulness and meditation, yoga, greater exercise, things such as dance and yoga and expression of the body will actually move the energy around the body, so it's not getting stuck all the time and needs to be discharged emotionally or through the voice. You can actually discharge energy and dissipate through stress management, things such as movement in the body and exercise. And rebuild your chemistry so that you will not have this somatic response. Many of us who have a somatic response, which is our body will shut down, we'll get a migraine. For me, the left side of my body starts getting tingly. I know when that happens, my body doesn't have the building blocks, and this is a lack of potassium. So I will take a potassium supplement every day, and I will be very mindful of the foods that I'm having in the few days after I have those symptoms. And I will put myself to bed earlier, and I will do more mindfulness, because I get one body this lifetime. And it is my job to take care of it. And it's my job to take responsibility for everything that it has experienced up until this time. And I'm getting closer to 40. And I know that as the closer I get to middle and older age, that my body is running out of resources because I've been pushing it so hard. And this is what stress adaptation is about, is no longer is your body able to do what it always has done. And so it's time to start doing the work, start doing the nutritional work, start doing the homeopathic and the miasmatic work, doing the behavioral, the relationship, the life work in building your life into a life that your body can live and thrive in. Putting boundaries on your relationships, putting yourself to bed earlier, saying no to things that feel dutiful or that you're doing out of obligation, because you have one vessel that you get to live in, but you also have one environment, and your environment is your life. And I'd like to extend that to say, as parents, we have a great responsibility, and it is all on us to create and provide that environment for our children, so that they are not going to grow up into stress mitigating, sensory seeking adults who bounce from one stress to another in their life because that's all that they know, and it's all their biochemistry knows how to do. We have to teach them about rest. We need to teach them about self-care. We need to teach them about self-regulation. And the best way for us to do that is to model it. So I hope this information has been valuable. I hope that you will share it with family and friends who will also benefit from this information. And thank you so much for listening. All the best.